This is Philip Pearlstein, and Joe Santore. I'm Louis Finkelstein. The panel discussion is, what should we do about the tradition of Cezanne? And how this came about was very simple. I was in the office a number of weeks ago and speaking to Rose Lowen, and she said, well, what should we do about the tradition of Cezanne? I said, we should sit down and talk about it. So I thought right away, for some reason, of talking with Philip about it. We put our heads together. We invited Joe Santore to join us. And we felt mutually that it should be an occasion of more discussion than lecture. However, in order to defend ourselves against the charge of wandering minds, we each did prepare, in the same way,
a novel.
some kind of notes to deal with, and we decided in a rather impromptu way that I would lead off. Bearing my soul, or at least my shirt. It's interesting to have it at this point because there's a great big Cezanne show coming up in Philadelphia, as you all know. And at the same time, in terms of his general influence or the importance of the issues that his work raises in what is called or what passes for the art world, there's basically nothing going on about Cezanne. And so there's a nice confrontation between honoring him and a great deal of interest in terms of a big show, and then a sense of drift that it's not, or the issues raised by his body of work are his importance, or what he teaches us is not in the center of the stage. The question boils down to really three parts. One, what is tradition? What do we mean by tradition? What can possibly be any artist's relation to tradition? More importantly than that, it seems to me, is what each of us pick up as distinctive in Cezanne. That is, why pick on Cezanne? Nobody's saying, what should we do with the tradition of Leger? Of course. And then there's the question of the should. That is, in what sense, from our discernment of what's distinctive about Cezanne, or how he has affected us as artists and teachers, is there any imperative, or in what sense is there a particular distinction provided to his work in a way that gives it a directive or categorizes a number of things which come after it? So that's the scheme of it. For that scheme, I have myself, that's the introduction. Now I'm leading off in terms of what I bring to the table. The most important and abiding answer to the whole question for me is simple imitation, like imitating Cezanne. And I imitated Cezanne, or tried to, from an early age. Even before I was out of high school, I copied the Rocks in the Forest of Fontainebleau at the Met, and I was one of the youngest copyists. I didn't know what I was doing, and I don't know whether I would know too much better now, but I was attracted to the painting, and the experience of painting from it, and going over the ground of it, which copying imposes, is in itself a formation. And it has the virtue of physical closeness and emotional openness. You don't know what will happen. And some of the memory of just doing that sticks with me. The second art book I ever bought, and I still have it, it's falling apart, but I still have it. Big fight on Cezanne, which I bought, would you believe it, for $3.50, color plates and all. And among other things, I simply loved the color of the ink on the pages. It was a magical experience for me. And then when I went to art school, right away, I tried to paint like Cezanne. And I even, at the end of my freshman year at Cooper Union, I did my version of the big bathers at the Barnes, or tried to. It turned into a Gauguin halfway through, but that's another story. Then, sometime later on, I actually devoted a lot of time to painting where Cezanne painted. If I put it all together, I will have spent in that fashion between 2 and 3 years painting in Aix-en-Provence. And I even kept my canvas and sketch box in the same little hut that Cezanne kept his canvas and sketch box in. And I painted from the motifs there, and I had a great time. Maybe I never painted any better than that even since. Although my paintings there weren't particularly Cezanne, but there was something about the place which made it very good to paint in. So just as in the first instance, I just stumbled into the Met and tried to copy what was there. Just being there was interesting. Eventually, I had to find a way, in order to contend with Cezanne, of how not to paint Mont Saint-Victoire, and I found the solution by getting up on Mont Saint-Victoire, then looking out from it. So you have to look at it. And then I painted some paintings when I came back from France. I felt while I was there that it was one of the most beautiful episodes of my life, which I don't really know whether to blame Provence or the time of my life or the weather. But I felt also that I didn't truly possess it. There was an identity question. I felt that if my artistic development depended upon the felicity of surroundings, which weren't intrinsically mine, in some way that was being a little false or open to questions. So then I came back and I tried to paint like Cezanne, or what I conceive to be the spirit of it. And it worked and it didn't work. But it goes through, a lot of things that other artists have done, like Picasso and Braque got a little mileage out of painting like Cezanne, as did later on Hartley and Gorky, and this repeats something which is done in literature as well, where Robert Louis Stevenson in his writing always set himself models, and Scott Fitzgerald, who we think of as very original, was said to have composed Latin verse in an iambic pentameter every morning before he started in his own work, in imitation of the Roman poets. And so there is a kind of a fashion or a tradition of doing that. Another thing that any number of people do is simply to have a couple of reproductions of artists that interest you. But then they have a way, of coming off the wall at you, staring at you. You're not up to the mark yet, something like that. If I tried to turn from those kind of natural and not too self-conscious experiences to something more analytical, it gets very tough. It's quite hard to nail down all the ways that Cezanne is positioned in our inheritance. I had a good friend, an art historian, who was quite brilliant even as a graduate student, so much so that his dissertation advisor told him, he said, when you're the person to do your PhD on Cezanne, he said, not for me, it's too tough. So he didn't. The general characterizations give us some skeleton framework, but I think that any kind of analysis of what one finds distinctive in Cezanne has to find a lodging place in particulars. And for me, for example, there was a painting in the Philadelphia Museum. It's of the woods around the Chateau Noir, and some of you know it. It has a millstone in the lower left-hand corner, and then trees, and then some quarried blocks lying on the ground. And every time I go to the Philadelphia Museum, no matter what else I see, I go to that picture, and I practically weep. It's just so moving. And why is it moving? Because the separate elements in it. This is just a personal report. This is a way of figuring out where do we start to talk about it. Each element is very scattered. It doesn't conform to any previous models of painting that I can see, but just the way the blocks of stone lie on the ground, the way the shadows slant, the way the mounds of earth and the foliage and the trees bend, Everything looks exactly as it did. I've been to the site many times in the course of painting and eggs. But of a heightened awareness, so that it's more like music or dancing. There's a physical specificity to each part which is enlarged by the feelings being modified by the feelings, even by other parts. The painting looks like just a wonderful concentration of being affected by the sense of sight and accompanying a sense of touch and a sense of moving in space. There's also another Cezanne which moves me in the Philadelphia area, the early big male bathers in the Barnes Foundation, you know, with the Saint Victoire in the background. Now, one of them, what I mentioned first, which is from the 90s, is done directly from observation, and it has all the thrill of the thought forming with the sight seen, where the earlier one of the men bathers is a wholly synthetic painting, which is painted over in the studio very tortuously over a long period of time. And both of them can be fit into some kind of ongoing history of some destiny to Western art and where it should go, which starts to answer the question. But when you reflect on the individual paintings and the evidences of how they're painted, when you really get up close and look at them, neither of those two, nor many others, for me the most moving Cezannes, appear to be historically necessitated. And I reflected on this just yesterday. I went to the Guggenheim Show of Abstraction, big show, and everything in there looks caused by history in a sense which, in Cezanne, it's not called for by history. He couldn't consult history. Nothing of his anxiety or concern or difficulty or fumbling, we can put it in a place in retrospect, but it wasn't known to him. Instead, it was much more local and immediate. And if I try to go to the subsequent question about art, what should we do about the tradition of Cezanne, or whatever we turn on to and feel moves us further, moves us in emulation or difference or analysis. Part of the problem is the difference between localism and cosmopolitanism. That what I saw in the Guggenheim is historically necessitated, is a product of a kind of dislocated consciousness, which we are all, in a certain sense, dislocated by. It's also the case, and part of the reason for what I mentioned right at the beginning, that Cezanne, except for when there's a big blockbuster show, is not in the limelight of people's indices of what should be done, is also a product of an artifact or a byproduct of cosmopolitanism. And that is the sense that history is moving very fast, you know, that something happened at a certain time, and then that's past and you can't do it, and then something else has happened and that's determined in a certain way, and that's past and it's out of the way. And there were important curators, critics, museum people, writers, historians, who have even stated in public that before 1920 is a closed book. They're only interested in developments past that. That, I think, is also a defect, a drawback of the consciousness by which we enjoy the world of art, is against the intimate, close, moving thing that happens. And compared to the development of Cezanne and his doubt and his not knowing quite what his ends or his means or his impulses were, many people of the ensuing generations, in my perspective, tend to cook their cake too fast. So I'll leave it at that for the moment. Let other people come in. Joe, you want to go something? I said I was going to do it. You said you've got all the notes.
It's a loaded question. What do we do with Cezanne? And, it seems like it's a question that was being asked even while he was alive. People were writing about what do we do with this guy? How do we understand him? What are these paintings about? Over the last few weeks, I've been making lots of notes. You can see them all here, trying to figure out what Cezanne has meant to me. And like Louis, I grew up with Cezanne. I'm from Philadelphia, so I had access to the museum from an early age and to the great Cezanne paintings there, the Bathers and Mount St. Victoire, and so on and so forth. So where to start? To start at the end, what do we do with Cezanne and work backwards? I mean, that's the question. Not to discuss, I think, the importance of Cezanne. I think probably everyone in this room would agree that he is an important artist, whether you like him or dislike him. Talk closer. Yeah. Cezanne and Van Gogh, I always put them together. I think of them together, even though one had a very short career, very short life, and the other one had a very slow and long life, and it's only because that's the way I came upon them when I was a child. So I think of Cezanne, Van Gogh. I used to think when I was a child that Poland was next to Ireland, you know, because in my neighborhood all the Polish people live next to the Irish people. So you think of things any way you want, you know. But I found myself after art school running away from Cezanne. You know, I would, and it's like trying to run away from someone that you never really understood, which is absurd to begin with. I was force-fed, so to speak, Cezanne. We had a teacher who was obsessed with Cezanne. She was a fanatic, and we would go out and do landscapes, and we would have to bring a Cezanne book. And if we looked at a motif, we would have to find a similar reproduction and paint what we were looking at and refer to the picture in the book to make some sense out of it. And none of us knew, you know, basically what the hell we were doing. We used a lot of blue and painted with a lot of patches and didn't finish anything and felt sort of ecstatic about the whole thing, you know. So this trying to escape Cezanne never really worked. I mean, he's a pest. He's like someone who you try to, you don't return their phone calls or answer their letters, and yet they keep calling you and knocking on your door, and they show up unexpectedly. I mean, I moved to New York. I'm there a year, and there's a big Cezanne show. You know, everything starts all over again. You know, and it's the same. I'm looking forward to this Cezanne show in May with great trepidation, because I don't know what's going to happen with my work. Usually it's a premonition of some disaster. So where do I start? I might start with a vision. Maybe that's always good to start with a vision. And I'll tell you a story, and then I'll get back to all this other stuff as we go along, okay? Okay, so one of my, I guess, pivotal experiences with Cezanne, and there's a lot of other stuff before this, backtrack, happened to me, and I remember it, and I always associate it with now an old friend of mine who lives in Tucson, Arizona. And it was 1970, and the two of us were standing on East 4th Street, I believe that's the name of the street, in Arizona, under a palm tree. And I had just met this guy, and he was a painter, and I was telling him that I had finally cracked the secret of Cezanne, that I knew the meaning of Cezanne's paintings, you see. And that Cezanne was mad. He was madder than Van Gogh was. And I had found out about this the year before when I was in Maine. I was in Maine, and I was on the beach, and I had taken LSD. So I sat and I stared at the ocean for about 5 hours without moving. And you see, And as I stared at the ocean, the waves would swell up and kind of hover over me, and then they would kind of roll in at me, way up, almost touching my feet, but never quite touching my feet. They sort of never quite got there. And this went on and on all afternoon. I could almost feel them, and just as they were about to touch me, they would recede again and roll back out into the space away from me. Finally, after being in this trance-like state, I got up, and when I got up, I looked at the landscape of Maine, and I thought to myself, I'm stepping into a Van Gogh painting. It looked like Van Gogh, it felt like Van Gogh, but yet something in my head kept saying, no, it's Cezanne. It's Cezanne. It's not Van Gogh. It's Cezanne. And I believed then that I was experiencing a vision of a perfect harmony. Everything sort of fell into this harmonious state. The birds, the gulls in the sea, the waves in the ocean, the grains of sand on the beach. Everything seemed to be exactly where it belonged, and it felt really good. And I started to think about my own breath, the way I was breathing at that time, and possibly about Cezanne breathing. And afterwards I thought to myself, Cezanne is like Buddha. He sits there and he stares at the mountain, and there's this space in between him and the mountain, and there's the sky over his head. And in a sense, he becomes one with the mountain. He exchanges places with that thing that he's looking at. And as he breathes, he paints. And as he paints the landscape, in a sense, he paints his own, he feels the pulse of that thing that he's painting. And then paints the heartbeat, his heartbeat, in the mountain. That's what was running through my head. That's what I thought about. And I was overwhelmed by this thing. And this is what I was telling my friend in Arizona. My friend didn't believe me. And he was an absolute, completely Cezanne nut. So much so that he named his son Paul and his daughter Cezanne. It's the joke. So, and he this is true. And now, I know that Cezanne didn't take acid, but I'm convinced, like, after all these years of thinking about this stuff again, that I was on to something that day on the beach, and that I was allowed briefly for those few hours to experience a vision that had something to do with Cezanne's vision. Basically, I was given an insight into the perceptual kind of sensations that he had experienced and labored very painfully through long and hard. And what got me thinking was that, do these experiences belong mostly to the landscape, to people who lose themselves in the landscape, and to the kind of silence that one can find in painting the landscape? Something that just that very word, silence, a place without noise, that is very foreign to us now, in the way we live. And I was wondering whether landscape painters today, I'm not a landscape painter, so I don't know for myself, but I was wondering that if landscape painters, even when they are allowed to find a place that they can go to, can in fact experience the same thing that this man was able to experience and work under almost 100 years ago. Or do we bring the baggage with us, the accumulation of sound and noise and visual stimulation that we are bombarded with on a daily basis to that experience. Is it possible? Is it possible to shut it out and come one with the thing again, the thing that we're looking at, or is it impossible? I'll end just in a second here and just say that some of the things everyone in this room has experienced, the idea that we've all watched thousands of movies and looked at countless hours of TV and have listened to radios constantly and have flown on airplanes and looked at the world from above and have driven in automobiles and so on and so forth, these things would be like miracles to Cezanne. So then I become perplexed when I think about the experience of what painting means. Is it possible to paint, to go, whether you're painting from life or whatever, abstractly, or landscape or still life or whatever, to detach oneself from the time that we live in and see the subject matter and bring to it that kind of concentration, experience that kind of a thing that Cezanne was able to. So I'll stop there.
Well, I think Joe's introduced what I was going to talk about to some extent. I think Cezanne can also be thought of as part of a couple of other traditions rather than an isolated phenomenon that starts a tradition. And what Joe described, sitting on the beach, is very close to, I guess, what could be called the Buddhist experience, and the kind of experience that's described over and over again by Chinese painters in those old books. I forget the name, The Way of the Brush or something. And I think somehow that Cezanne knew that tradition and hooked into it. And you don't have to have any kind of deep mysticism, but a sense of identifying with nature is really part of that. And I recently, someone sent me a book, sent my wife a book rather, which is a book on paintings in the Hermitage. And the author is Colin Eisler, who's a professor at NYU. This was written in 1990. And what he says is really startling. And this is just a general interest book. It's not a specialist. It says, Cezanne is the eminence grise of modernism. This is true right up to the present. A major paradox of that movement is the way in which one of the most isolated, hermetic of painters should have had his pictorial weight thrown around with such enduring results. The absolute character of Cezanne's achievements can be seen as albatross and inspiration to Western painters for well over a century. And this is all the more remarkable as the artist falls into a special category, as does Van Gogh, devised by Max J. Friedlander, who was an eminent art historian, that of the genius without talent. I thought that was a fantastic phrase, genius without talent. Utterly lacking in facility, terrified by the nude, with academic drawing, perspective, and anatomy utterly beyond him, Cezanne had to reinvent the painter's wheel. His art, all basics, with no back to. Well, he goes on to say, the best of Cezanne's paintings suggest an artist whose creative biography was a pictorial equivalent to that of the late Helen Keller's, but with a big difference. She, born deaf, dumb, and blind, learned just barely and almost inaudibly to speak. Had he been she, Cezanne would have suddenly burst into Brahms' Alto Rhapsody or written Moby Dick. For me, that was a fantastic statement because it brings up two things. Cezanne's paintings before he had some sort of moment of enlightenment, which is implied here, are very expressionistic, and they are very, in our eyes, very crude, heavy-handed, and not necessarily related to anything else going on at the time. They look very crude, very badly done. But there is an expressionist element in his work all through his life. I mean, if you really get up close to some of the paintings and you see them under raking light rather than a neutral light, it's amazing how the paint is piled up in some places. It gets very thick, almost a half-inch thick. In other places, it's very thin, which means he kept jabbing and jabbing and working away at the painting in a real expressionist manner. But that's not the part of Cezanne that's had the big influence. So the other thing that interests me about this statement by Colin Eisler is that he does not go on to say exactly what it was that Cezanne did, that everybody's been influenced by. And I don't think any other art historian does either. They just talk about him as an influence, but without going into what he really did. And I think he summed up a couple of things. Well, the most obvious is that, I mean, if you just think of him technically without going into any psychological thing, he took the kind of the patch that the Impressionists did, the patches of paint, and made a system out of it. Okay, so what's the system? And the system, I think, is really revealed by his drawings more than the painting. And I was also terribly influenced by a book when I was young. I bought this at the, I can't think of the name of the gallery, the Valentine Gallery. It was about 1950 or 51, and they were selling it for like $3. And it's almost been a Bible to me. But it has all kinds of drawings, including the expressionistic ones, and all kinds of series views of the Bay of Marseille, that little statue, front and back, and so forth. And what I finally concluded from it was that he would sit and stare, in a Buddhist sense, at the landscape, or at the figure, whatever, this little statue, and he would identify with it. He'd become one with it, which is part of what the Zen Buddhists did. The Zen Buddhists would stare at a rock and become one with it. And then when they felt its pulse, the beat of the universe and so forth, everything you were saying, they then very quickly splashed down, with a brush and ink, marks that indicated what it was they had experienced. I think Cezanne did something very much like that. He looked at the form or landscape and puts down marks, just fragments, scattering where things are relative in relation to one another, without worrying about describing what they are. In other words, where they are is more important than what they are. And it becomes a record of the pattern of eye movement. And that coincides with modern experience. If you think the Renaissance is fixed point of view, fixed vision, nobody experiences that anymore in our time, except through a camera. We see in fragments, and everything is just patches. And somehow we have to organize, if you're a painter, you have to organize those patches. I think that's what the Cubists picked up, the Futurists, and everybody else who's at all been influenced by Cezanne. It's that. Everything's in motion. Every time you look up from what you're drawing, things are in different places. Overlaps don't occur exactly the same way. You know, the line of the roof goes this way when you look at it that way, and when you slant your head another way, it goes that way. So he found a way of dealing with that by just indicating fragments. And it's that fragmented vision that really is what we experience, and some of us fight against. I'll stop there.
I think we confirm each other on the intensity of the experience. For myself, I'm a little disturbed, even though I understand where you're coming from, that it's Oriental.
Well, but the Oriental, it's Oriental, but the Orient has been big in world history. And also one of these little, I don't know, I brought with me a number of fragments of articles I've tried writing over the years. And one of them I said, try to say that the Western way of thinking about, you know, the picture plane as a window or something, measurable space or perspective construction, only lasted a couple hundred years. The rest of art history has to do with, 2,000 years of art history has to do with this Buddhist concept, or with absolutely flat plane experience. And Eastern influence has been in the West for a long, long time, ever since the beginning, middle of the Renaissance anyway. And in Paris in the 1900s, all you have to do is read Proust and you read all about chinoiserie dominating everybody's Hokusai's mangas, all those Japanese prints floating around had a tremendous impact.
I guess that's why I like that middle Cezanne with the male bathers, because it isn't flat, because it's a very deep space and it doesn't come about.
Well, but I'm not talking about the Japanese prints, which are flat. Okay.
No, I'm trying to see where is Cezanne and where is the Orient, or where there are strains in Western thought which are very secular, which are very involved with being in the world. I agree there is an enlightenment. There's something very challenging to all of us in your notion of fragments, but there's, and this is one of the ways to me that makes Cezanne interesting. There's a mighty resistance to not cooking your cake that fast. I mean, the idea of a trance, of a mystical reverie as against the analysis of the world. And I don't think of analysis only as a dry kind of engineering dissection. I think that's very sensuous, very physical, very involved in the world, rather than wanting to transcend it. We all looked up things when we were preparing for this talk. One of the things that I just caught a flash of, I was leafing through Maya Shapiro's book on Cezanne, and the last paragraph is how much he made an art out of a wholly secular instinct, or a wholly secular affirmation, and why I'm feeling a little resistant to it being related to the Oriental is really in two ways. One, it isn't my figure of Cezanne that he had a target in view, which would be one of the implications of having those models. He had a number of models, and if we read Cezanne himself, it's always looking for something which is physical and in the world. He speaks of like being respectful of what he called the Italian primitives, that is the Quattrocento Italians, but for him, the Venetians have more guts, they're more carnal, they're more in the world, and something isn't altogether rendered by the trance-like notion. At the same time, I think it is true, although I've never had any LSD, I'm still different generations than you. I always thought when people were talking about no, I always thought when people, like, what was his name? Timothy Leary? Timothy Leary, the American father of LSD. You know, he wanted to make a religion out of that in a way. And people were giving accounts, as Joe gave a very telling account of his experience. I said, well, all that vision is what artists do when they're arting. That is to say, it comes about by a different route. And the other thing is that it's fumbling. It's a three-syllable word because it takes long to do. And whereas Oriental art is an art of performance compared to Oriental art, all Western art, even refined artists like Holbein or Bellini or somebody like that, or Piero, are groping compared to that. And so there is, granted that we see the world fragmentarily.
Right, okay, there is another tradition.
Well, we'll have also.
Another tradition. And that's, ever since Michelangelo didn't finish those slaves, there's something called the tradition of the unfinished. It has an Italian name, I can't think of it.
Non finito.
Non finito, thank you, right. Which is, which is one of the main currents in Western art. And the non-finished also coincides with sketchbook. Everybody made sketchbooks, and nothing is finished and everything's overlapping, and it's full of fragmented images. I think he also could have drawn on that, or did draw on that, very easily.
Joe, you wanted to
No,
comment?
well, I'm just thinking that maybe,
But
I
I'm
didn't,
sorry.
yeah, pick up on
Don't put down the mysticism part. A lot of people really do experience it. I won't say I do. But it's a very real thing for many, many people. Somewhere else in here I have a quote from Mondrian which describes him staring at the sea and what he experienced.
That's a good counterexample. There I'll go along with you, but it seems to me I can turn that to my objection. That is to say, in Mondrian's desire for transcendence, there is a psychological way of handling himself to get to a conclusion which seems to me quite at odds with, antithetical, the other side of the coin, from the tussling and the internal adjustments of Cezanne. He tries to follow Cezanne in various ways, but his desire to transcend, his desire to be spiritual, his desire to reach some kind of absolute, which also is part, if we say it literally, the tradition of Cezanne, things that people have interpreted out after Cezanne. That strikes me as a foreign strain to what's buried in its carnality, buried in its preoccupation with the continuity of things. It's true that both Cezanne and Michelangelo are non finito, but I would say not because they accept the fragment. I think they're both upset by the fragmentary nature. Now, it may appeal to us in the same way as true. Details of Giotto sometimes appeal to us more than the whole composition of a Giotto. Fragments of classical sculpture have a certain appeal, which, the whole sculpture maybe wouldn't if we saw the Venus de Milo with arms, or that beautiful fractured figure of a youth in the Diocletian baths, which, as a fragment is so wonderful. But I don't see it's a part of their drive. The non finito, Cezanne and Michelangelo, it's probably despair, but it's also anxiety, because it's like carrying the most delicate attachment in each successive move to a point where it could shatter. And that's a different kind of concern than the Oriental blending in with the one. I'm not anti-Oriental, but I
No, but I think you're jumping too much on what, in other words, what I was saying was my experience of Cezanne. I'm not saying that, maybe he did experience that. I don't know. I don't know what he experienced when
He never
painted.
said anything.
I don't know, So it's just, but I think each generation can look to Cezanne and find different things and be informed by different things. Whether or not it is this kind of Buddhist thing that I touched on, which only came about because I was high, whether or not he was experiencing that who knows? But you can look at the paintings and interpret many things from the paintings. I mean, look at the difference between, go back again to Van Gogh. You have Van Gogh, you have Cezanne. Both, in a sense, one very visceral, very passionate, and very connected to the objects that he's painting, Van Gogh. I would think, when I think of Van Gogh, I think of a love for a certain chair, a certain flower, not just any stool, Gauguin's stool, so on and so forth. When I think of Cezanne, and I'm just making a split now, we can debate this afterwards. I think of someone who is, in a sense, denying that object. He's painting the object, but in one sense, he's removing the object to get to something else, to get to some bigger kind of harmony. The same with the light. Van Gogh is painting the sun, he's painting the stars, he's painting the gas lights, he's painting the things that are out there. Cezanne's light is an interior kind of like coming from color. Especially in paintings like the card players and paintings like this. I think there's too much made out of Cezanne of this aspect of truth. I think Cezanne knew that it's impossible to deal in truth. So the paintings are made up. They're structures that are recreations of things. They're not real places. They're places that are many places. I don't know if you call them fragments or what, but in places the fragments synthesize. They come together to make a new kind of reality that becomes in times unquestionable reality.
I don't disagree with your final statements, but it doesn't seem to me to be authentically the trip. We're right in the midst of what has been said in many ways about Cezanne. There's a tension between the autonomy of the internal relations of the painting is revealing their own truth. That's another way of saying what you said. Right. But then, how could he do this? And what was the formation? And what is the further input of his tremendous scrutiny of just what's in front of him? The little painting in the Philadelphia that I cited with the millstone. It's very exact. You can walk on that ground and see that those quarried blocks are still lying in the same place. Those weeds crop up between them. He is extremely faithful to the particulars of the motif. And even after the time of that particular painting, it was about 92, 93, he wrote to his son, and he said, here I'm standing by the bank of the Ark River, and this was already late, like 1904 or 5, somewhere around there. He says, I think I can spend a whole lifetime finding motifs just by inclining my head a little bit one way from the other. And why did he have to at that point? If it's transcending the particular, was he so involved in the particular? And that's the tension, and that's what I felt, even in painting in X, the localism of it, how much he was key to so many particulars.
Yeah, but isn't that why he's such a difficult artist? I mean, one of the problems I've always had with Cezanne from a young artist is that dichotomy, it's constantly perplexed me, I mean, the difference between the subject and this thing that he does, which I've never quite understood. I mean, in other words, take the card players. I mean, I grew up around card players. I probably saw more card games in the first 19 years of my life than Cezanne did in his 67 years.
At home, not in the museum.
Watching watching people play pinochle and whatnot. And I would look at those card players and I would feel this is not a card game. It has no sound, it has no noise, it doesn't feel like card players. Now I'm looking at it from a different perspective. I'm looking at it at the subject of a card player. So it was a problem for me. It was just like the big bathers were a problem. I never knew what the hell with all these people standing around with their heads arched over, all these naked people. I didn't get it. It was a problem for me. And these are difficult paintings. And I think it's that kind of dichotomy that makes it so interesting on one hand, but yet makes it so difficult. Like your graduate students saying, "Not me. I don't want any part of it." You know, I mean. Yeah, I mean, you know, I talked to Al Held in the early 70s. I said, Al, I don't get it. I feel like I'm left out of some kind of secret club. Everybody who loves the bathers knows something that I don't know. You know, tell me, what is it that I'm missing here? Tell me about, give me the insight into it. And we talked about cathedrals and this and that. And he said, you know, keep going back, you'll get it. It's 25 years later, I'm still trying. Once in a while I get it. And other times I don't. I find them very difficult. I don't know.
Well, I still think it's the process that's important. And I think there are two kinds of artists, and sometimes they come together. There's a public person and a private person, or public art and private art. And I think when Cezanne's pursuing, you know, those little marks, it's a completely private thing. By accident, he became public. He wasn't working for anybody to respond to it in any way. He was just working, experiencing it for himself. Van Gogh, on the other hand, is a very public artist. He knows exactly how, and he's very, what he's doing, how he's concerned with how people are going to see the work, how they're going to react to the different colors. And he leaves directions for how to look at each of his paintings.
Since you make that dichotomy, would we step back and say, what should we do about the tradition of Van Gogh? Would it have the same meaning as we feel?
No, can't. It doesn't. Van Gogh sort of ends with Van Gogh. That's what's interesting. Cezanne, it continues. Cezanne is open and accessible. That's what's exciting about it on one hand and problematic on the other hand. That's the dilemma. What do you do with Cezanne? What do you do with Cezanne when you're a teacher? What do you tell these students? You know, here's Cezanne. Here he is. You know, just like the teachers were telling me, here's the book. Look at Cezanne. Look, I don't know what the hell they were talking about. So you know, how do you get people to understand this guy who's working 100 years ago, very slowly, very privately, like you said, very in tune with his own world, and then suddenly we've picked up on. I don't think he is a forgotten artist. I think he's a very
we're all up here obviously because we have an attachment to it. But what do you think about in terms of practice in the world at large? You know, or issues. Well, the practice of art in the world at large, what curators understand, what writers and historians understand. You know, it's all very well for Colin Eisler to say.
You mean about Cezanne? Or
Yeah.
what
Yeah. How do you
well, you know,
reconcile?
I don't know.
Do you have any thoughts?
I haven't thought about that. I mean, Cezanne had the advantage of that there was no Cezanne. I mean, he didn't have any Cezanne to look at. We're stuck with Cezanne. You know, I mean, we can't get rid of
That's
him.
really
We keep
excellent.
looking at Cezanne. You know?
There's a composed paradigm.
Yeah, he's there. Anyway, so I get all. See what he does to me. It's automatic. Just get you all worked up.
Anyway, if I can read something else from one of my fragments here. A long time ago, I was reading about the Dadas. I don't know. I was at the Institute of Fine Arts and got a degree in art history. And
Don't hold it against.
I was all involved with Picabia. At any rate, I came across this thing by the Futurists. I'm trying to remember which one. Well, at any rate, One of them wrote, this is the futurist, the Italian futurist, wrote about the Impressionists, Cezanne, and the Cubists in just a couple paragraphs. They credit the Impressionists for showing, and this is in quotes, the reciprocating chromatism which welds an object to its milieu and is a first attempt at pictorial dynamism. End of quote. And Cezanne for showing, in quotes, that things appear to us only through contrasts of tones and are fundamentally nothing but a combination of motions. Hence, his stupendous effort to harmonize his sense of volume with his vision of brightness. The end of quote. For the futurist, Cezanne differs from the Impressionists in the static vastness of his work and his sense of volumes, whence his importance to the Cubists, for whom, again, quotes, objects resolve themselves into planes and convex and concave surfaces, variously inclined, which make manifest an organism whose externally visible aspect is but one of 1,000 views made possible by dissection. In Cezanne's painting, a hill is not a mere swelling of the ground, but a complex object whose essence is revealed by its sections. The field is not merely the green surface seen by the ordinary mortal, but a centripetal mass with underground stratifications, a profound cubature. Anyway, these precedents enabled the futurist painters to realize one of their chief aims, which is to achieve a sense of motion, a visual throbbing to correspond to the throbbing of the universe, to have the observer sense that he was being whirled into space to become one with the heart of the universe. I think a lot of artists have fooled around with that idea since, including a lot of the abstract expressionists. The idea of paint moving across the surface being the starting point of some sort of sense of being whirled out.
I don't mind the paint moving across the surface, but there's that religious note which many people took up on.
You have Kandinsky in The Spiritual of Art, a whole book on it.
All right, he's part of the tradition of Cezanne, I guess you could say, but does he carry the ball?
Kandinsky?
Yeah.
Oh, he carried a ball. And you could even talk about the problem of Kandinsky now, and it would be interrelated with the problem of Cezanne.
Well, I think if there are claims to reaching an absolute, to get to the throbbing heart of the universe, there are actually more people following the example or the polemic or the program of Kandinsky and the futurists, who, in the example you cited, they write better than they paint, than there are following the example of Cezanne.
Yeah. Well, I'd say that any artist that gets concerned with, this idea of where things are and so forth, where they lead you, is in the tradition, same kind of tradition that Cezanne was in. And even people who do installations. What's his name? Mike Kelly, throwing things on the floor. He's concerned about where on the floor they are. Or the show of Jessica Stockholders at the
But we're making a
Dia Foundation.
You mean we're all in a big tent, like
Yeah.
the Republican Party?
Yeah.
I mean, you could come back to.
I mean, you can define the tradition going on in many ways.
I mean, I was looking at some of Cezanne's letters, and he's very clear about what he thinks painting should be. He just says, I have a quote. I'll read it. It's short. He says, "We must not be satisfied with retaining the beautiful formulas of our illustrious predecessors. Let us go forth with the study of beautiful nature. Let us try to free our minds from them. Let us strive to express ourselves according to our own personal temperaments. Time and reflection, moreover, modify little by little our vision, and at last comprehension comes to us." That's what Cezanne says. And he says it over and over again. We must go back to nature. But it doesn't tell us how to do it. See, that's the thing. He doesn't say do it this way or that way.
That's because he probably read The Way of the Brush.
Right, maybe he did.
That sounds like something.
No, but I think
from it.
that puts, if we, just for the sake of argument, eliminate the Mike Kellys and the Jessica Stockholz,
Please.
and keep it within a realm of painting and a realm of say, looking, you know, of this kind of perception that apparently he was talking about. Then what do we do with Cezanne? And what has the 20th century done with Cezanne? I think maybe that's your question.
Yeah.
Just saying, how did, you know, I was looking at Picasso recently. I was searching all through Picasso. I really didn't find Cezanne. I mean, I maybe a bit here and there or something, more so in Braque, much more so in Braque. But, you know, they take an aspect of Cezanne, which becomes Cubism, and for years and years and years, we always hear, you know, there's always this thing about, you know, this turns into this, so, you know, Cezanne, and then you have Cubism. But it could be interesting to say, no, Cubism is an aberration of Cezanne, and therefore, where does Cezanne go? What do you do with Cezanne? And then we're left with a kind of void, because Cubism is the main kind of force and motivation between a lot of the 20th century, structurally. Huh?
Well, that's part of my complaint about history. That's why I think, like, the Guggenheim show looks much more like historical consciousness than what is more gratuitous and uncaused and waiting to come about by specific limitation and submission to finitude, which is also why I'm protesting against these religious thoughts of the absolute. I think there is a real issue in there in the 20th century.
You have to define religion there.
Yeah,
I think you're mixing two things.
Well, I'll define it almost in like a 12-stepper, a power greater than ourselves, where I think Cezanne is totally, although the evidence is he's a practicing Catholic, I think as an artist it's a power within himself for which he doesn't have any other appeal than the traditions of the culture of art rather than of, in Shapiro's terms, stressing the secularity of finding himself a secular person and dealing with a wholly secular situation, non-transcendent. I agree with the visionary nature that when we look at the finished work,
yeah, that's what I'm talking.
you know, it's a revelation, but because of the sustaining of a focus and not an appeal to transcend, to escape to it. I mean, what I mean by religion is the way, and I go back to the Guggenheim, is a contrast, because I entered this discussion as a contrast with what is Cezanne today. At the top of the Guggenheim show about abstraction, there are these big Gerard Richters, you know, which speak about the unknown. And it's incredible.
Who says it speaks about the unknown?
He does, Richter and Mark Rosenthal, both. You know, and it's presumptuous. That's one is startled by the presumptuous. And I think that there's a real nexus about historical determination, which a number of people ride on, according to the pattern you were just beginning to sketch out. You know, it says that leads to Cubism, It doesn't happen that way. History is just one damn thing after another. And the person that really exists in history is the person who does not accept or is formed by a calculation of a historical determinism. It's true, Cezanne says, move into the future, but that identifies his profound sense of himself as a free individual. And I think that Cezanne comes out of and belongs in the tradition of liberalism and enlightenment, which continues through the 19th century, opening up the importance of the individual. But if the individual is important in that sense, and in the careful, agonized, anxiety-ridden way that Cezanne is important, he doesn't have access to those higher freedoms of an absolute.
Yeah, but maybe Cezanne was. I mean, I have a letter with Cezanne saying, "What is it with this painting? You know, do you have to be a monk? Is it one's religion?" He says that in his own words. So maybe in his isolation, it's not like he's setting out to have a religious experience, but it's just that it happens anyway, in spite of. It
has the character of and is a substitute for and a replacement for. It doesn't avail itself of those certainties or consolations. But people want to get it on. Should we let somebody else in? No?
I heard you you have to have the truth. You have to go back issues of writings on art. In other words, one place I heard was that Cezanne was trying to make over in color the Renaissance. In other words, the apple, one plane was one color, another plane was, and he was trying to figure out, according to his time, and make the Renaissance over in his own time. Does that make any sense to you?
Well,
He said that about Poussin. Isn't
He
it?
said it about Poussin, he said it about the Renaissance, but he said make it over from nature. And he also said you have to study in the museums, but eventually
Cut the strings, you know. It's,
you
it's
have
the,
to
the
cut
Louvre, the Louvre is our book. We go to it, but then we cut
But the
the
one,
strings.
I still think that you have to go back to what he does at the start of all his things. These little marks that are scattered around. Even if he's copying something in the Louvre, it starts that way, which has nothing to do with what Rubens or whoever did it. I think his big accomplishment and why everybody still sees some sort of debt, if that's what tradition is that he legitimized blowing things apart visually. With him, the Renaissance truly comes to an end. A single vantage point thing no longer exists after that. I mean, legitimately after that.
But you know, this. How do we swing this into to start to address not just Cezanne as a painter and all the different aspects of Cezanne, but the main question of this discussion is that what do we do with Cezanne? How does one continue as an artist? And this is a very perplexing question when one thinks about it. And on one hand, you can ignore it and just paint. I mean, you don't have to think about Cezanne. On the other hand, just for the hell of it, to address this to have some fun here, hopefully, you know, to start thinking about it in the times of the things that we have experienced, like thinking back to the story I told you, right? That was around 1969. 3 months later, guys go to the moon. There are men walking on the moon, right? First time men can look down and see the Earth. They can see the orb of the Earth from the moon. That's a hell of an idea, you know what I mean? That's something that, you know, I kept thinking about that and thinking about that. And no, I've never heard artists get excited about that. Maybe because they knew they could never go to the moon.
Al is excited about those things. He's in the...
Well, he should be here. I should have called him.
Al
But,
could well comment on it from the point of
But yeah, but the fact is that that's a hell of an idea. The fact that you can, you know, could you think of like Cezanne on the moon, Cezanne with Jacques Cousteau under the water? I'm using it metaphorically. Cezanne on a subway, Cezanne at Coney Island, Cezanne on a roller coaster, Cezanne on rollerblades. You know what I mean? You can go on and on and on. How do you know?
You can visualize the sketchbook he would make on those experiences.
Yeah. I mean,
It sounds to me the same thing like the communication superhighway. You can get more channels to say less and less. I think going to the moon and underwater are in the same way.
But you can't deny that they happened. How can you shut yourself off in a box? I mean, it's one thing to go back to Cezanne's place where he worked and look at it and try and experience those things. It's a wonderful thing. I'm sure it was a wonderful thing. I remember your drawings from it in the show you had. But can we, you know, there's something.
I don't propose myself as having a complete answer about
You know,
what I am is objecting to the perspectives where we have to face these as if all these intermediating facts are themselves imperatives. I think in Cezanne's case, Philip mentioned very well from the Colin Islip quote that he had no talent, that he worked like a primitive, that he was a clumsy expressionist that didn't know how to handle his medium. And at the same time, he was forced by his reverence for the art of the past to find ways of mastering his clumsiness.
He invented a new way, is
and
what Paul
invented
said.
a new way and was continually in the process of renovating that invention, I think it's fair to say.
Yeah, but he was working. He didn't know. I guess he knew he was. He constantly refers to his things as experiments. He very seldom says the paintings. He's always talking about experiments, and he's working in this isolation, right? I mean, am I wrong? He cut himself off
Well,
from the...
he cut himself off to
from
degrees. He's a
showing.
sophisticated man. He was an able scholar. He
Right.
read books. You know, he wasn't a golfer.
Does he ever say what he's experimenting with?
No, just
Towards-
that vision, that looking, that perception, you know.
Well, we have some fragmentary accounts of theories that he had, which he did discuss in late life with several people, and whether they give a completely reliable account is subject to some doubt. But he did try to explain his feelings and his ideas and where they came from. But I think he called them experiments because there was his mind groping out to try to find a rational grounding for it, and his anxiety as to whether his comprehension of the issues was up to it. Part of the drama of his life is that doubtfulness that he got there because his targets were bigger than other people. He knew he wasn't painting for a market, although he hoped to achieve the esteem of at least some part of an audience, but he had no sense of knowing how to make a product.
I just wonder, isn't this perhaps something that Cezanne did that we can continue to hold as a principle without getting too caught up in mannerisms or particular styles or even philosophies? Well, philosophy in this sense. A lot of people notice that, you know, Cezanne's, or they say Cezanne's are always unfinished, but I would prefer to look at the glass as being half full than half empty, and I would say that isn't the thing that he did, didn't he devise a language whereby these pictures are complete at any time? And isn't that then something that everybody today takes into account in some way, that whatever object they're working on, it's a complete arena at any time in which to discover. It doesn't need to reach a point of completion somewhere in the middle whereby they begin to discover things, but rather it's a place in which to act and to discover from the onset.
Well, the non finito, I think, deflects the question of finish away from the objects known as objects to the work itself as producing its meaning out of its relations. And I think it's a very good point that in the late works, and particularly the watercolors, they are finished with each stroke. But by another standard of where language poses itself against the world of appearances.
But you know, I'm plagued by this question, you know, of what do we do with Cezanne? I mean, I don't, you know, what you said. I don't see the paintings as unfinished. That's not a problem with me.
No,
I mean, you know,
I just mean that one thing we do with Cezanne is we take a rectangle, some of us, or some of us take something else, and start with it, and have a notion of it as being complete from the first mark we put on it.
Right. But in Cezanne's own words, he's saying we must move forward. You know, we leave the past. We always must move forward. You know, so my problem becomes if we settle for trying to put this into words. In other words, if we settle for just say approaching nature the same way Cezanne did, you know, just say, okay, I'm going to go in, clean slate, you know. In a sense, are we moving forward, or are we being suddenly just catapulted back into history?
Well, before I let the other people in, let me just answer that point from what I said of my own experience, because I consciously, in a long time, almost naively, although reputed to be some kind of an intellectual, just, you know, imitated, like the brushstrokes, the colors, the motifs. And then I found at various times my discontent. In the case when I was painting in X, because it wasn't real to my own sense of where I was placed in the world, when I was painting even more Cezanne's imitating paintings in the 1970s in Queens, from highways and roadways, modern material, you know, transportation, speed and all that, I was discontent, and my discontent, I think, is the most propelling force that I have, and it happens automatically. There was a thing in the early days of abstract expressionism in the club, the phrase that everybody uses, no, it's not that. And to have continually in front of you The motto, no, 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 it's not that, is what leads you away from your source into some unanticipated future. And I have a helpful motto in my studio, and I've had it up for several years, and it looks better every day. It says, it's going to take longer than you think, even. There were some people who wanted to come in.
Can we call Cezanne a loner? In other words, not a rebel, exactly not a conventionalist painter, but someone who was a localist who followed his own vision. And that, ironically, here we are many decades after his death, discussing how to fit him back in. And maybe we should just say he's something of a loner whose work we really like, society really likes. And if you can get personal inspiration from it, okay, but he's to some extent unjoinable with the mainstream.
Then you spoil all the fun, though. You ruin the discussion. You see, Cezanne was many things. He was a loner, but he also showed in he lived in Paris. He was an intelligent man. He showed in the Impressionist shows. He was respected, admired. I found a letter by Gauguin that Gauguin wrote to Pizarro saying, "What's the secret of this guy? Tell me. What's he doing? I don't understand it." You know. So he's a very complex character that we're dealing here. I don't think we can. We could maybe say that about Rousseau. We could say, let's enjoy the Rousseau paintings. He made them. They're terrific, and so be it. But Cezanne is someone that you can't do that with. You can't. So I mean, talking about what the tradition of Cezanne, I think is interesting because it encompasses not only Cezanne but the whole tradition of painting. What do you do with painting? I mean, people have been saying for years, painting is this, it's that, it's dead, it's revitalized, it should be this, it should be that. So what do we do as the year, the 21st century approaches, which might be significant or might not mean anything, but it's just a good point,
Wendy?
Yeah, I think one thing that I think in terms of Cezanne is he slowly, he changed the syntax or the lexicon of pictorial language by his doggedness to try to realize his sensations. And I think what we can learn is not to follow his language particularly, but the courage to find a language that appropriates or approximates something of our intentions. And it's this struggle that he was able to go. I mean, other Gauguin went in another direction, he did other kinds of things, but Cezanne really hit the grammar of the pictorial vocabulary. I mean, he really changed our grammar in many ways. And it's that kind of courage to change grammar, to change syntax, to not have to use same kinds of transitions or intervals, that is probably something we can learn from, not in imitation, but in courage to slowly follow this kind of path. I mean, that's just one.
Yeah, I mean, of course.
And one other thing, he was always, or at least you always had it quoted, that he was always going like this, that he, folding his hands together, it's finished when this is realized. The two hands meet. Because there was some structural reality that he wanted for all the parts, and it wasn't even a classical structure. Some people have even called it Gothic, with its buttressing. And it's in order, because it looks like it's going to topple very often. His paintings look like they're falling off. And so he's buttressing all over to keep the thing from falling into the abyss. So that's another aspect, too, of a different kind of spatial control and balance.
Right. But what would you say? Would you say that Cezanne, he leaves Impressionism, he works on his own, and he makes this what we could call a new kind of space? Huh?
Well, the language of space.
Right, language of space. And I'm saying and then that language of space is taken. It manifests itself in many different influences, but I'm wondering. The question is that gets me going is, how can one look at nature and doing just what you said, exactly what you said, and come up with another kind of space, or even a newer space? Is it possible? Is it? Because he's working in that spirit. According to his letters, he's working in that spirit. He's working in the spirit of finding something new. He's not settling for the past.
you know.
I think you have to see the pictorial language is fluid in that way, that it is not fixed and it can change, and you can't have a formula for how it can move and change. Gorky did attempt to move somewhere also with language in that way, and he had a short life in terms of unfolding what might have happened. But I think it's the fluidity of language, that it's not fixed meanings, that there are no fixed meanings in it.
That's an important point.
Yeah, but essentially, you know, any number of artists could have been picked on too. But why Cezanne? Why did he become the leading hero, in a sense?
I think he's more strong. Oh, that's other people.
Yeah,
Yeah.
other people. No, somebody had their hand up in the red hat there. I'll come back. She got a hand up.
Mr. Finkelstein, I really want to address you, because when I was young, I was very impressed with Cezanne. He was more than anybody else. And of course I was an exile supervisor. And the readers say the word exile supervisor pleased me very much, because when I was there, I got the strangest feeling. I felt not as though I was looking at something that Cezanne painted. I felt as though I was in a Cezanne painting. I also felt that Cezanne was a realist, because when I looked around, I remembered the red in the grass, and I had told how he put red in the grass. Well, they were poppies. I'm sure they were red. And I thought it was great, it was beautiful, it was so beautiful, it was just unbelievable. And I wonder if you have that same feeling.
Well, Provence is a great place to paint it. I mean, there's a whole lot of reasons for it. The climate, the color of the light, the fact that it's geologically irregular, but yet a very long cultivation, and therefore there's a regularity built into the landscape by human culture. It's a great place to paint, particularly if you're Cezanne. I mean, there are other Provençal painters whose work is garbage, but it has many kinds of, itself, a complex history and culture to it. And it's just physically very felicitous. I missed about Valerie.
Okay, I'm going to direct this for Mr. Pearlstein. How has Cezanne influenced your painting?
Oh, well, Cezanne, as I said, I was very involved with it, and I spent a period of about 7 years doing paintings that I thought combined, let's say, New York abstract expressionism, Cezanne, and Southern Sung landscape painting. And I struggled with that, and the sense of constant moving and shifting and so forth. And at one point I went to Italy. I never got to... the only time I ever saw Mont Saint-Chapelle was driving... Mont Saint-Victoire, I'm sorry. Was when we drove past it very fast. Again, it was a kinetic experience. But in Italy, I got very much involved in drawing and painting Roman ruins. And those were all blocks that had been worn down and by the wind and so forth, rain, and being chiseled at. Anyway, things began looking more and more like bodies. And that was the next step.
Does he continue to influence your painting at this point?
Well, in the sense of overcoming it and trying to, I mean, I recognize that vision is fragmented, and the only way you can control it is through some sort of perspective construction, which I don't want to get involved with too much. And I try to reconcile all these things that keep shifting and moving around. So I'm always very conscious of that aspect of the painting problem that I really think he dealt with. And
I guess what I'm asking is, formalistically, are these things that you things from Cezanne, things that you still think about a lot?
yes, right. By fighting it and trying to control it.
Any?
I think there's an underlying assumption that Cezanne is really sincere and genuine and he conducts his experiments with a lot of integrity. And I wanted to ask you guys, do you think the tradition of Cezanne is one of integrity? And if so, how have we moved away from it?
Yeah, it's a good question in terms of more recent history, because there actually was a time, and I would date it somewhere in the 1960s, when artists came out with the idea that you didn't have to be sincere, and all this wringing one's hands about being an individual and dealing with your own personal impulse and experience was too much romanticism. And it was under various headings that, after all, an artist is only doing a job of some kind of work, and why doesn't he get on with the job and quit pissing and moaning about his soul or something like that? And I think that one of the more important things that was said tonight was Wendy's about the question of emergent language. That I think, one of the, in a philosophic dimension, that why Cezanne strikes us so much. We don't have to read the philosophy or attack it from a philosophical point of view. But the question of an emergent language in the course of one's detailed and sustained experience with the world, and particularly in the face of what Philip has touched on, the world doesn't stand still for that language to fit it. That the only way that can be transacted is by the individual. Because for the next individual, it's another story. I think we go to school, that we look at logical ways to construct paintings, logical ways to draw things from paintings and traditions of the past. And, we're all, according to our own, I would say for myself, stumbling fashion, we're all are creatures of a lot of study of the past, but you get past it when you contend with the question, is the language I'm using, or the language which is emerging, as it was for Cezanne, and what I've tried to depict as this continuous trepidation over its fragility and its unforeseen outcome, is it something which I can not feel is mine in the possessive sense, but does it accord with my impulse? Does it have a ring of truth? And for me, that has happened very, very slowly, out of the confusion of many targets, many enticements off of a beaten track, and with no end in sight.
Well, can I say?
Yes.
I think a shift in emphasis occurred somewhere around the 60s, too. 70s, mostly, that abstract expressionism and all of everything that went on related to painting and sculpture I think in the 40s and 50s really had to do with, the medium, the doing of things, the artist's experience in constructing works of art. I think, in a sense, art history became very popular and very easy. It became very easy to become a writer about what's going on or what's going on in somebody's work. And I think interpretation became dominant and eventually took over. Subject matter, political correctness, whatever you want to call it, became dominant. And which has nothing to do with the process of making the work. So it depends on whose point of view you're talking from when you ask that question. I think from many artists' point of view, they're still being very sincere. It's the interpretation that becomes something else.
There was a one-man show of Cezanne's work at the Metropolitan Museum many years ago. There was, I overheard a number of academician artists who were amazed at looking at, this is a sort of landscape. They couldn't understand where Cezanne did the foreground and then he pushed the mountain right up to the front. And then another painting where he had one vision, half of the canvas was one vision, and another part of the canvas was another vision, and he put it together. And like an apple was almost falling off the table, he put in a lot of suspense. And a lot of information that since Cezanne's time on, none of the academicians did Cezanne work in terms of the Renaissance. No artists. I've examined the exhibits and the exhibits. I wonder how up-to-date artists could do as a Renaissance artist, three-dimensional. But the popularity of the flat surface became dominant after that. There was a battle, a political battle between those who worked in three-dimensional and those who worked in two-dimensional or flat space.
But you have to blame Cezanne for that, in a sense. I mean, Cezanne is in part responsible for just what you're talking about. Right? You know, he has this dichotomy that you know, something is here at the same time it's back there. This tension that we always talk about. And many artists did. Consequently, we have modernism, and we have, you know, we have.
Was the cube, the triangle that Cezanne was working with. Those basic structural spaces. In other words, in the landscape, he saw triangles, and he saw a tree in terms of a round curve. You know, and then, well, the academicians couldn't understand it.
Well, I think the principal problem with whatever could be meant by academism is believing that there is a norm for vision, whereas what Cezanne was working in the face of is that when you really experience the world in a way which hits you directly and emotionally, in the sense that several of us have tried to outline, it does not conform to those conventions. There's a glaring example of that in a fairly recent and popular, in my way of thinking about a very bad book. It's called the Cezanne and the End of Impressionism by a historian named Richard Schiff. And in there he takes what to me is a wonderful landscape of Cezanne's in Chicago from the Auvers period, and he says, well, it just doesn't study nature properly because it isn't uniformly lit and your eye doesn't move through it in planes, and all those things which what you would call academic pleads as normative from a prior tradition. First of all, I'm sure they have nothing to do with Veronese and Titian and even the Girl on the Iron, people like that. But it's not true to experience. And the claim is that there's one thing that things look like and another thing which Cezanne is doing, which really muddled the soup an awful lot.
What do any of you think of Cezanne in relation to the late Titian?
They're both very good.
The late Titian broke up things by brushstrokes in a very similar way. I don't know if Cezanne is in some way influenced by that. He's not all that independent.
Well, he was very interested in Venetian painting.
Sure.
I mean, it's like, yeah, yes.
Precursor of all of that. The breaking up and working with brushstrokes.
Well, but historically, if you're just not taking it as an historical force, but simply an historical sequence, what Titian did was open up language to a great extent, which was then subsumed into various other conventions, which, like any other forming of language, as Nietzsche points out, are all metaphors. They're just reshaping some experience. But it isn't until Cezanne that, because of his great culture and his great, since it was mentioned, sincerity and emotional intensity, I think more than anything else, that crumbled or undermined the sense that the conventions were viable. And mind you, he said, paint Poussin, I want to paint Poussin after nature. And the whole question of after nature means directly, not by an a priori received version of what it appeared to be.
can I just, I want to just address Ernie's question again, because I think it's a good, it was a good question in terms of the majority of the audience here are students here at the school, and that whole question of truth, and then how does one proceed, especially as a young artist, and in this tradition of Cezanne, and you know, the idea of the again, the anxiety of does the world we live in now allow a Cezanne to exist, and when you, how can I put this? When you think of science, okay, you think, I have a friend who's a microbiologist, microbiologist, okay? And she's been taking the ovaries out of fruit flies for 20 years. And for 20 years, she stays in the lab 12, 13 hours a day, looks under a microscope, and trying to unravel the mysteries of DNA. If anybody reads the Science Times, you can see over the last few years, every Tuesday, practically every other Tuesday, they've unpeeled the skin off the secret. Same way with astronomers who are looking now at the stars. You hear about a guy who's spent half his life, 50 years, looking at one star, waiting to see a wobble, you know? He's just waiting for that little wobble, just to see if there's a significant some diversion there that would indicate the presence of a planet or another body. That this kind of concentration and dedication, is this possible in painting? Does the time we live in allow this? Does the time we live in, huh? I don't, well, look around. Why not? Go to the galleries, go places, look around, and I don't.
You're not saying, will it reward you?
I'm not saying, yeah, no, I'm not saying will it reward you. And that's what I'm saying. Cezanne walked away from it. You know, we can call it a Buddhist experience or just a grumpy old man who didn't want to be bothered with anybody anymore. You can call it any kind of experience, but he had the experience, and he leaves us with the paintings, and the paintings are, because of their nature, accessible in a way. They provoke us. They're not closed. I mean, I love Van Gogh. I look at Van Gogh paintings and they send me into ecstasy, especially certain ones. But I don't feel them accessible like Cezanne paintings. You see what I'm saying? I think they're complete. They're what they are. And you look at Cezanne paintings and you're confronted with all these dilemmas. You feel one way, you feel the other way. You hate them, you love them, you don't understand them. They present many, many, many problems, and that's what's exciting about Cezanne.
Question, and I think we'll close soon, but let's have a couple more.
Yeah, I'm a landscape painter, and I ended up with art. I've also painted still life for a long time. And my way into Cezanne originally was when I started looking at the still lifes and realized how much more softly and openly he saw these things. Painting landscape is enormously anxiety and wonderful. Can't control it. And I've always felt, and this is going to be provocative, that Cezanne was, in a sense, the beginning of the end. What we have now is a life in which most of us defer our experience, our physical daily experience in many ways, in as many ways as possible. Of course, this started with me comparing ourselves to elements, being able to feed ourselves comfortably, but it's gotten to be kind of crazy where virtual reality is something that we're attracted to. Mudrooms, and you know what those are.
Can you explain that?
Mudrooms, in computers, people meet in mudrooms, computer in cyberspace. This is attractive to many people. I feel that, like his contemporaries, when people came before him, Cezanne worked from life. He was aware of what was around him in a way that few of us really can be. I mean, they didn't have telephones back then, much.
You don't have to answer the telephone.
No, but the thing is that
No.
I feel when I started landscape painting and started looking at things, I understood why I had never particularly cared for Cezanne. She was like Van Gogh for me, and he wasn't like Renoir as a landscape painter. I feel that Renoir looking at women, there's a little bit of a defermentist reaction. In landscape, I always felt that Cezanne went out and he looked at what he could handle and nothing else, and that's why he's so attractive to people. And that's why, in a sense, he's the beginning of the end. Degas was doing it too. Degas was taking photos, and they both made beautiful pictures because they were both trained and they both drew from life and they both opened themselves to it. But I feel that a real openness, a lack of wanting to control what you see by stylizing it through reducing their sense of color. I mean, I've been outdoors. I've been in the south of France. There are more colors than he saw. And while I've always been awed by his ability to take it apart and make clear sentences of it, I've also always felt that he wanted to control it more than he wanted to be in it. I don't feel like that is the worst.
Well, I couldn't disagree with you more, but somebody wants to speak perhaps on that.
Could I touch a little bit on your original question?
Yeah, that's good.
Okay, good.
I very much like the way Joe has brought out his difficulty, the evident contradiction between the different parts of his effort. Something that we all feel, I think, however deeply we love Cezanne, the sheer difficulty of reconciling all the conflicting things that work. I think Joe brought that out in a really remarkable way. But with that in mind, I think it might be useful to dredge up that phrase of Harold Bloom about influence being a sequence of misunderstandings or misreadings. I think if you look at how Cezanne actually has affected the art of the 20th century, one of the intriguing things that you see is that his influence too is irreconcilable, is contrary. Just think of a certain, almost the obvious examples. Cezanne, Picasso and Braque go to Cezanne just at a certain point, and they produce cubism. You might say that they're thinking about the famous letter to Emile Bernard where he talks about nature being, etc., etc., etc. Although undoubtedly that was a misunderstanding of what Cezanne meant. If he meant anything at all in that letter, it had something to do with the models that they used in art schools to help you draw. But anyway, there's Braque and Picasso doing what they're doing for Cezanne, which, by the way, means throwing away color for the time being, which means exaggerating, not to say caricaturing certain aspects of, for example, the less dark landscape. Almost at the same time, there's Matisse with a little Cezanne hanging up in his studio that he absolutely hocked his house to get, his most precious possession. And what is he deriving from it? Well, it's some very complicated and almost wordless message about the relationship between color and drawing. It has nothing to do with cubes, but it has a great deal to do with the relationship of color and drawing. Let's think of later instances. Cezanne was the only modern artist that Soutine would recognize and allow as an all sorts of other suggestions. Reject them all. Cezanne only. Soutine, where does he fit in between Picasso on one side and Matisse on the other? Morandi has the same story. What about putting Morandi alongside Soutine? How does that work?
Well, they're both extractions in different
For
ways.
example, think for a minute of the two greatest essays to be written in English about Cezanne in the 1920s. One by Roger Fry,
Right.
one by D.H. Lawrence. Reading them today, you are convinced that this is great art criticism, They don't agree about a single bloody thing. Now, the point I'm trying to make, I think, is that if we're going to acknowledge the vitality and the power and the force of Cezanne, I think we must, if we love it. We have to be prepared to throw up our hands and say, I don't know what it's like. We have to be prepared also to say, if I am going to really try and get to grips with it, ecology, I've got to be prepared to misrepresent it. And perhaps the most dramatic instance of that kind of misrepresentation is Giacometti, who I suppose you might say is the true descendant of Cezanne's anxiety, if not of anything else. Now, you might equally say that he's the greatest caricaturist of Cezanne's anxiety. I mean, how one evaluates what Giacometti did with Cezanne, I don't know, it depends on Giacometti's reputation, but it's perfectly clear that in all those cases, what has taken place isn't an understanding, a comprehension of what Cezanne is about, but a radical misunderstanding. And I think, I would suspect, I would suggest that it's in that notion of a radical misunderstanding that the answer to your original question.
It's interesting, very interesting.
It's very much the case that they have all put their spin on it, and intervening between Cezanne and ourselves, we have the opportunity to assess our own impulses to this reading. One more question, then we'll close.
Along these lines, for me, what Cezanne means, first, the reason I think painting is compelling over all these years is because it contains, aside from subject matter, great painting, there's a built-in paradox to it. The fact that it's spatial on a flat plane to begin with. That's the basic one. And then it goes on and on. So why painting stays compelling is because life itself, metaphorically, is about, in a sense, containing within ourselves the uncontainable. Painting contains, the greatest paintings contain the most uncontainable forces. To me, Cezanne underlines this fact. And with all of the pieces that go into making any painting in our history, in the history of painting, Cezanne takes these pieces apart. And as he's putting his own painting together, he emphasizes these forces that quiver. And that's one. The other part of Cezanne, just one more thought on this line. That's one reason why Cezanne, to so many abstract painters, I mean, in a sense, that's what abstraction is. It's the removal of the making of the thing from the thing. I don't know if I'm being clear on that. But. So I think that's why Cezanne can be important to so many people, like what Andrew was saying, and because abstractly he's anyway, going on and on. The other part of Cezanne that's important to me is that there's an incredible, and I don't think what Joe was saying before about a religious experience had anything to do with something being absolute. I think it's an open-ended kind of empathetic quality that when looking at the mountain and feeling its pulse and feeling your own pulse. And to me, it's in all great painting, an incredible ability to empathize. It's in great actors. You know, they can become, with such a, they can give up their ego in a sense. Now that's not to say you dissolve into, that's the paradox. You don't dissolve into a puddle, you become stronger. And so, what am I saying?
You said it.
You said it.
Louis, can I read just one quote?
You want one too? No. Just him.
Go ahead.
I want to read this one quote. Okay. This is Cezanne, a letter to Émile Bernard. 1904. Painters must devote themselves entirely to the study of nature and try to produce pictures which are an instruction. Talks on art are almost useless. The work which goes to bring progress in one's own subject is sufficient compensation for the incomprehension of imbeciles. That's what Cezanne says.
But only almost.
There's no tradition.